The story begins on a late autumn afternoon when I came to this mountain. City life, with its endless grind of work, wore me down. The stuffiness comes not only from polluted air or close-knit buildings, but also from invisible pressure, from the exhaustion of creative inspiration, which is my lifeblood. I am a writer, or at least I used to be. Months passed, the blank page remained blank, the mind was empty, and the desire for an escape became more and more intense. I need silence. I need solitude. I need a place where the only noise is the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, where the only light comes from the fire in the fireplace. And so, after much searching, I found it, a cabin for rent deep in the mountains, far from any trace of civilization. The owner, through a brief phone call, seemed rushed and almost relieved that someone wanted to rent. He described the property as old but sturdy, sitting on acres of land surrounded by ancient pine forests. "You should arrive before it gets completely dark," he advised. "The dirt road there is narrow and quite dangerous when night falls." That warning, instead of making me apprehensive, aroused a strange feeling in me. Perhaps a little danger, a slight encounter with the wild and unknown, is exactly what I need to reawaken the extinguished fire of creativity. I arrived when dusk was gradually falling. The sky above the towering pines was tinged with eerie purples and grays, heralding a cold night ahead. The wind had picked up, whistling through the tall trees, creating a ceaseless chorus, a sound that was both majestic and somewhat ominous. Stepping out of the car, I immediately felt a change in the atmosphere. It was thick, heavy, and a strange oppressive feeling came over me, as if the night itself was watching my every move. The vast space of the silent forest, dotted only by the yellow porch light, flickering weakly from the wooden house, suddenly made me question my decision. Is this absolute solitude what I really want? My heart beats a little faster, just a little. I reassured myself that it was just the excitement of starting a new adventure. The wooden house appeared before our eyes, small and modest compared to the majesty of the surrounding mountains and forests. The wood has faded over time, and the porch has a tilted angle. Inside, the air smelled of mold and old wood. The bare plank floor creaked under every step. The wallpaper had turned yellow, and in some places it was peeling, revealing the gray stucco underneath. There was only a simple bedroom, a small kitchen with basic old appliances, and a main living area with a massive stone fireplace occupying a corner of the wall. The furniture, including a worn armchair, a sunken sofa, and several wooden chairs, all looked as if they had seen decades of neglect or overuse. However, despite its old look and typical scent of time, this place exudes a rustic charm, a feeling of complete separation from the outside world. I found a small wooden table, placed in the corner of the living room, right next to the large window overlooking the dense pine forest. It seemed like the perfect location. I picture myself sitting here, looking out at the quiet scene, letting my ideas flow onto the page. It will be my ideal refuge, where I renew my energy and find myself again. If only that peaceful atmosphere could last forever. The first night passed relatively normally, at least by the standards of an old wooden house in the middle of the forest. The floorboards creaked every time I shifted my weight. The sound of wind rushing through invisible gaps somewhere made the curtains occasionally vibrate slightly, enough to attract my attention for a moment. I built a small fire in the fireplace. Firelight dances on the wooden walls, creating strange silhouettes but also bringing a warm and comfortable feeling. Outside, there was no sound of traffic, no lights from the neighbors' houses. There was only the sound of the wind whispering through the needles, the sound of dry branches colliding with each other, and occasionally the distant cry of some night bird. Almost absolute silence, something I have longed for a long time. I slept deeply, though not entirely peacefully, on the sofa near the fireplace. The second day, I spent most of my time exploring the surrounding area. The pine forest surrounds the house like a natural fortress, with tall, straight tree trunks reaching up to the blue sky. About 100 meters from the porch, I discovered a small depression where the ground sloped down, covered with rocks and moss. Here, A cluster of pine trees grows so densely that their branches intertwine overhead, forming a natural dome that almost blocks the sunlight. Stepping into this small forest, I felt like I was lost in another world, a place that during the day never seemed to reach. The air here was much colder, and a slight chill ran down my spine. I quickly convinced myself that it was simply the lack of sunlight and the already chilly mountain air. That afternoon, I sat at the wooden table by the window, feeling my inspiration begin to rekindle. I wrote a few pages in my notebook. The words flowed out quite coherently. A feeling of pride and satisfaction washed over me. In that brief moment, the wooden house truly seemed like a secluded paradise for writers. I thought maybe I found the right place. But then the third night came, and that fragile sense of peace began to crack. I fell asleep on the sofa again, lulled by the crackling fire in the fireplace and the gentle howl of the wind outside. Suddenly, I woke up startled. The old clock on the mantelpiece read 3:14 a.m. My heart pounded loudly in my chest. My veins pounded in my ears. I don't remember what I dreamed about, but a vague feeling of uneasiness, a sudden wariness, invaded me. I sat up straight and listened. The house was suffocatingly silent, with only the sound of embers crackling in the nearly dead fireplace. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was very faint, almost inaudible, mixed with the sound of the passing wind. Came from outside the window. It sounded like someone was speaking, but not in clear language. These are discreet, mumbled sounds, indistinguishable into words. My breath caught in my throat. I sat motionless, straining my ears to listen. With every heartbeat pounding in my chest, I felt like that whisper was moving a little closer, as if the person or thing making the sound was moving slowly toward the window where I was sitting. My scalp started to tingle. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead and palms. My fingers trembled as I groped for the flashlight I had left on the coffee table nearby. The light from the embers in the fireplace was too weak, only enough to cast dim shadows in the room. I didn't dare turn on the electric light inside, afraid that the light would signal whatever was out there that I was awake and paying attention. With my heart feeling like it was about to jump out of my chest, I forced myself to tiptoe towards the window. The glass was cold as I pressed my ear to it, trying to hear better. The whispering seemed to be right outside. I slowly raised the flashlight, turned on the switch, and directed the light out onto the porch. Trembling rays of light swept across the old wooden boards. The empty rocking chair swayed gently with the wind, and the dark corners danced under the lights. There's nothing there. And as soon as the light swept past, the whispers suddenly stopped. Silence returned, only the familiar sound of the wind cutting through the pine trees. I stood there for a few more minutes, my heart still beating wildly, trying to calm myself down. Maybe just an illusion, due to fatigue, caused by my unstable mind? Wind blowing through tree branches can make strange sounds. I tried to stick to those reasonable explanations, but my hands still kept shaking for a long time after that. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I sat on the chair, my ears perked up, listening to every little noise in the house, every creak of wood, every rustle of the wind, until the first rays of dawn crept through the crack in the door. The next day, daylight seemed to dispel some of the invisible fear. I was determined to find a reasonable explanation for what had happened. Could it be the sound of wind whistling through a gap somewhere in the roof? Or is a small animal like a squirrel or weasel nesting near the windowsill? Determined to stay rational, I spent the morning walking around the house, meticulously examining the ground, especially the area outside the living room window. The porch was covered with a thin layer of dust, but there were absolutely no unusual footprints. There was no sign that anyone or any animal large enough had approached the window last night. If so, it must have left a mark on the surrounding dust or soft ground. Not finding any concrete evidence gave me some relief, but at the same time sowed another insecurity. If it's not a person or an object, then what is that whisper? Temporarily putting aside the unanswered questions, I told myself that it must be due to my anxiety and overactive imagination. I returned to my desk, trying to focus on my work, but the words now seem harder to get out. My concentration was constantly broken by memories of last night's eerie whispering sounds, of the feeling of something approaching in the darkness. And then Wednesday night came. The fear I tried to suppress surfaced again. This time, I decided to go to bed early in the bedroom, hoping that the change in space would help. I thoroughly checked the doors and windows before going to bed. But right around that time, around 3 a.m., I suddenly woke up again. Not by a dream, but by the sound itself. A low whisper, but this time it seemed more urgent and more terrifying. It seemed closer than the night before. My heart almost stopped when I realized the sound seemed to be coming from right outside the front door, probably in the porch area. The whisper was still indistinct, but its intensity was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I lay still on the bed for a few seconds, trying to control my increasingly rapid breathing. Then, with a mixture of determination and terror, I reached for the flashlight and small box of matches I always kept in my bag, an old habit from camping trips. Cold sweat broke out again as I tiptoed out of the bedroom. The floor groaned under my feet. Every little noise seemed to echo more loudly in the tension that filled the house. I moved slowly toward the front door, my heart pounding against my chest. Approaching the door, I stopped. Part of me screamed to go back to the bedroom and lock the door, but another part, morbid curiosity and fear that something worse would happen if I didn't confront it, drove me. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my hand holding the flashlight from shaking. Should I open the door? That thought was fleeting, crazy, and dangerous. Paranoia eventually won out over recklessness. Instead of opening the door, I carefully unlocked it and opened it a small crack, then quickly shined my flashlight frantically across the porch. The rocking chair swayed and creaked again in the night wind. The dust on the porch floor was still intact, without any obvious footprints. The night air was cold, colder than usual, and my breath came out in thin puffs of smoke in the flashlight beam. The darkness just beyond the edge of the porch seemed thick and impenetrable, giving the impression that something was lurking, waiting just out of sight. And once again, the whispering disappeared as soon as the light appeared. There was only the sound of the wind blowing through the tall pine trees. I stood there, opening the door a crack, straining my ears to listen for a few more minutes, hoping and also afraid to hear that voice again. But there was only silence, a heavy silence, making me feel exposed, vulnerable, as if I was being observed under an invisible lens. Unable to bear it any longer, I slammed the door shut and locked all the bolts. But the feeling of safety never came. Sleep is now impossible. I returned to the kitchen table, sat there in the dark, feeling like my chest was being squeezed by an invisible hand, refusing to let go. I sat like that until the faint light of dawn began to peek through the window. Thursday's daylight did not bring the clarity I expected. Instead, there was a cold realization. This was no longer a coincidence or a momentary hallucination. This is a model. There was a presence, something hovering around my cabin at night, whispering just outside the walls. That thought made me unable to dismiss it as a product of my imagination anymore. With an almost desperate vigilance, I circled the house again, this time examining every inch. And then I saw them, in a piece of soft, wet ground near the edge of the pine forest, where sunlight rarely reaches. Traces. They are not as obvious as shoe prints, but more like vague, indented impressions, possibly made by a bare foot, or by something else. They weren't many, just a few marks, running around a corner of the house and then disappearing into the dense bushes. My stomach turned when I saw those marks. A stream of cold air ran down my spine. I tried to reassure myself. Could it be old animal footprints? Or of the hunters and hikers who passed through here long ago? But they looked new, and the instinct deep inside me, the terror coursing through my veins, told me something else, something much darker. The rest of that day passed in extreme tension. I can't focus on anything. Every sound, no matter how small, the rustling of leaves, the sound of tree branches hitting the roof, the vague clicking from within the walls, was amplified in my mind into potential threats. My chest kept tightening. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I paced back and forth in the living room, clutching the matchbox like a useless weapon, bracing myself for an invisible intruder. The vast space outside no longer brings a sense of peace. It becomes oppressive, threatening. I felt like there were countless pairs of invisible eyes hiding behind every tree trunk, watching my every move. The mounting anxiety distorted my perception of time. The afternoon seemed to last forever. I found myself drinking cup after cup of coffee, a desperate attempt to stay awake and alert, to fight off the encroaching drowsiness and fatigue. As night fell on Thursday, my mental state was on the brink of collapse. Even the smallest noise makes me jump. I stood by the living room window, my hand holding the flashlight shaking, my eyes glued to the darkness outside, waiting for even the slightest sign of movement. The sound of the wind whistling through the pines now turned into a demonic chant in my ears. My imagination drew strange shapes crawling in the darkness between the trees. My heart was pounding so hard I felt like it was going to bruise my ribs. And then, around 3 a.m., I had begun to obsessively check the clock. The whispers started again. This time, they are different. They didn't just come from one direction, but seemed to emanate from several directions at once, moving around the outside walls of the cabin with an unusual, ghostly fluidity. The sound is sometimes near, sometimes far, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, sometimes it seems to come down from the roof. I felt dizzy with terror, my mind spinning. My fingers were numb as I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I pressed my ear to the window, trying my best to understand the words. But they were still meaningless, just a jumble of sounds, half-syllables that sounded both frantic and hysterical, and also had a strange melody, almost melodic in a creepy way. For a brief moment, perhaps lasting only a few seconds, I froze. I was completely convinced that something was looking at me through the window. My eyes were fixed on a faint shape, a shapeless shadow that I could only glimpse at the edge of the faint light coming from within. My breath caught in my throat. It was a tall, thin figure, standing motionless just outside the glass. And then, almost as soon as I became aware of its presence, the figure disappeared. It didn't run away. It didn't step back. It simply disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a strange feeling of quiet, a completely wrong and scary stillness. My skin was as cold as ice. A wave of nausea rolled from my stomach. I stumbled back, almost dropping the flashlight. With a choked cry, I frantically shined the light out the window again. But all I saw were pine tree branches swaying gently in the night wind. Nothing else. That night, sleep completely left me. I sat huddled in the armchair, the matchbox still clutched in my hand, leaning against my thigh like a useless talisman. Every muscle in my body tensed, ready to face a threat I couldn't see, couldn't identify. If it weren't for the dawn that finally appeared, breaking through the thick darkness, I probably would have completely lost my mind. When the first rays of sunlight shone through the window, bringing warmth and light, I felt such an overwhelming relief that I almost burst into tears. The thought of spending another night in this cabin, with something lurking around, with incomprehensible whispers lingering in my ears, had become unbearable. That morning, the decision was made decisively. I will leave, right away. The original plan for a 2-week retreat was completely abandoned. My nerves were too tense. I couldn't concentrate on any work, and whatever glimmer of creativity I had earlier had been completely drowned out by the accumulated terror. Packing took place in haste and panic. I threw clothes, notebooks, and laptops haphazardly into my suitcase, no longer caring about tidiness. My heart was pounding, adrenaline pumping as if I was racing against an invisible deadline. I kept glancing over my shoulder, out the window, certain that if I took my eyes away from the darkness for even a moment, I would see a ghostly face pressed against the glass, or a figure gliding across the porch. Every little noise made me jump. As I loaded the last of the bags into the car, I stopped and looked back at the grounds one last time. The tall pine trees still stood there, silent and somewhat ominous, their tree tops like claws scraping the gray morning sky. The wooden house, bathed in daylight, looked ordinary, even somewhat old and pitiful. It didn't seem like it contained the horrors I'd experienced these past few long nights. My heart pounded, a strange mixture of relief that I was almost free and a nagging fear that some part of this place would haunt me forever. For a strange moment, I had the feeling that the cabin knew I was about to leave, that whatever was residing there was sorry to see me go. That thought alone was enough to send a shiver down my spine. My hands were cold, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the fresh and cool morning air. Driving off the bumpy dirt road, I tried again to rationalize everything. Could it be just the wind? The wind blowing through the pine forest can create countless strange sounds. Maybe isolation, being alone for too long in a strange place, can cause hallucinations and negative psychological effects. Could it be due to lack of sleep and stress? Is my mind playing tricks on itself? Part of me desperately wanted to believe those explanations. But then the memory of the vague footprints on the damp ground, the fleeting silhouette outside the window, and most of all, those persistent, ghostly whispers returned, dispelling all attempts at self-soothing. Those whispers, they haunt me. The feeling of being watched, the feeling of a nearby presence, did not subside until I had driven a few miles past the old wooden sign marking the edge of the property where the cabin belonged. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting, half afraid to see some movement, some figure chasing me. A few days later, the homeowner sent an email to inquire, realizing that I had left earlier than expected. I replied in the vaguest terms possible, just saying that I had urgent personal matters to attend to and thanked him for renting the house. I cannot recount what I heard, saw, and felt. Part of me knew he wouldn't believe it, or worse, maybe he knew too much about what happened there, and I didn't want confirmation of what I was still trying to convince myself was just a product of my own fears and imagination. Weeks, then months, passed since I returned to my small apartment in the city. Life slowly returned to normal, but something inside me had permanently changed. My nights are sometimes still haunted by nameless anxiety. I often wake up startled in the early morning hours around 3 o'clock, my heart pounding in my ears, with a terrifying certainty that I just heard that faint whisper, right outside my bedroom window. My mind kept returning to that wooden house, to the terrifyingly quiet pine forest, to the mysterious footprints on the ground. The small box of matches I brought back from that trip still sits on my nightstand. A precaution that might seem silly in a modern city apartment, but somehow it gave me a fragile sense of control, a tangible connection to that horrifying experience. I've replayed those nights in my head countless times, dissecting every detail, trying to find a thread of logic, a reasonable explanation that could string it all together. But I kept running into dead ends. The only conclusion I can draw, although not a pleasant one, is that sometimes we accidentally set foot in places that do not welcome our presence. Places that hold echoes of ancient stories, energies darker than anything we can imagine. The rational part of me still tries to dismiss it all. Wind, isolation, psychological influence, stress. But on those quiet late nights, when my mind was uncontrolled and freely drifted to that dimly lit porch, to the incomprehensible sound of chanting just outside the thin wooden wall, I remembered that horrifyingly real feeling. I could almost feel the cold breath of that whisper against the window glass. And I couldn't escape the thought that the forest surrounding that cabin was not as empty as it seemed. Something was there in the darkness. It has been following me. It whispered right on my doorstep. Even now, in my safe place, I sometimes find myself pressing my ear to the apartment window, listening unconsciously, looking for the faintest sign of that ghostly voice. I told myself I was safe, that whatever haunted that mountainside was bound to that particular piece of land, that it couldn't reach me here, in the heart of this noisy city. But there was a nagging fear that remained, a constant echo in my mind that refused to be silenced. A cold suspicion that if anyone else, another solitude seeker, set foot in that old wooden house, they too would hear whispers in the night. They will also feel that presence, weaving between the pine branches. Maybe they will initially brush it off as a joke in the wind, just like I did, until the inevitable truth slowly dawns, that they are not alone. No matter how much I tried to leave that place behind, no matter how much distance I tried to keep, I was haunted by the knowledge that certain places in this world carry within them a form of life of their own. An ancient, mysterious, and at times cruel life. A life that can touch you, change you, in profound and disturbing ways. I left before something worse could happen. But sometimes I wonder, is a part of me still stuck there? Stuck in endless nights, with the constant whispering? Sometimes I feel as if I'm still standing there, in the musty living room of the wooden house, clutching the flashlight in one hand, holding the box of matches in the other, holding my breath, waiting for the next murmur to pass through the darkness. And that, perhaps, is a feeling that will never truly go away. An echo from the deep forest, whispering forever in my soul. My job is not flashy, nor does it require much intelligence. I am a night watchman, a ghost walking around in the heart of a giant, old mechanical factory. For hours every day, I am immersed in the ceaseless roar of machines, a mechanical symphony so monotonous that I sometimes wonder if it still has any meaning, or is just the lifeless echo of a world that has fallen asleep. My shift consisted mainly of walking, a solitary patrol through the production areas, making sure that the steel monsters were still in rhythm, that the emergency system, which the managers always talked about, was ready. I am like a lone sentry on a deserted battlefield, always on guard against unexpected incidents. A sudden power outage that plunges everything into darkness and terrifying silence, or occasionally, an electrical short circuit that shakes the whole chain, like a convulsion of a metal heart. To be honest, I've never really minded loneliness. In some ways, it is also a liberation. No jostling, no having to face judgmental eyes or meaningless small talk. I like the relative silence amid the noisy machinery, like the feeling of being the only one awake in a sleeping world. But that night, everything was different. The night when the familiar loneliness suddenly transformed, becoming something much stranger and thornier: fear. A primordial emotion that crept into every vein. My shift had passed for about an hour, in the usual emptiness and monotony. Suddenly, my eyes stopped at the far end of the hallway. An emergency light, hanging from the cold concrete wall, was flickering unnaturally, ominously. Its pale, weak white light seemed to be about to die, only enough to illuminate a narrow section of the wall, revealing peeling paint, scratches, and dirt accumulated over the years, traces of a place where people rarely set foot. First, I just thought it was simple, probably a loose connection, or maybe the light bulb is old and about to expire. It's a daily thing in the district, nothing worth worrying about in an old building like this. But there was something about the way it flickered, irregular, erratic, on and off, that made a sick, uneasy feeling rise in the pit of my stomach. It didn't feel like a mere technical problem, but like a signal, a warning whispered in the silence. I decided I needed to replace the light bulb immediately. The official reason is to prevent any possible electrical problems, no matter how small. But deep inside, I knew I was doing it to get rid of the feeling of insecurity that was slowly crawling down my spine, like an invisible insect. I want the light to stabilize again, dispel that haunting, flickering darkness. As I got closer, passing through the silent spaces between rows of resting machines, another sound entered my ears, separate from the familiar buzzing. The sound of tap, 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 echoed softly but clearly throughout the long and narrow hallway. It could just be the sound of water dripping from one of the exposed pipes running along the ceiling. This building is old, and such random noises are not uncommon. My brain tried to come up with a reasonable explanation, but my heart told me otherwise. Something about the rhythm of that tapping, steady, almost deliberate, made it beat a little harder, pounding in my chest. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being too sensitive. Instead, I focused on the task at hand, the flickering light above. I pulled a small aluminum ladder from a nearby corner. The sound of the ladder's feet rubbing against the concrete floor sounded dry. Carefully climbing up each step, I began to remove the old flickering light bulb. Midway through, out of safe habit, I took a quick glance down the hallway, just to make sure there are no forklifts or pallet trucks moving towards you. Sometimes, previous shift workers carelessly leave them in unexpected locations, and I don't want to be the victim of a silly collision. That's when I saw it. Not forklifts, not pallets. It's a shadow on the far wall, where the emergency lights shined. It had the clear shape of a human, tall and thin, and it stood completely still, motionless like a black statue. I froze on the stairs, still clutching the old light bulb. My heart seemed to stop beating for a beat and then speed up again. At first, rational thought tried to reassure me. It must be my own shadow, created by the eerie, flickering light of the lamp I was repairing. Perfect explanation. But then I realized the angle was completely wrong. I was standing on a ladder, quite high above the floor, and leaning slightly forward. My shadow, if there is one, must fall to the floor or be at another angle. This shadow was standing vertically on the wall, as if someone was standing with their back pressed against it. To be sure, I tried leaning to the left, then to the right. I even tried waving my free hand. My shadow on the opposite wall, if there had been other light shining on it, should have moved as well, if only a little. But that shadow did not move. It still stood there, still, a solid black mark on the gray concrete, as if it was watching me, waiting. My pulse pounded in my temples. My fingers suddenly became sticky and slippery on the cold metal steps. I had to try to take deep breaths to stabilize my breathing, which was becoming rapid. I tried to rationalize again. Maybe there was another light source I hadn't noticed, somewhere behind me? Or is this just an optical illusion, a play of light and shadow in an old hallway? I glanced around, looking for anything that could create that strange shape. But nothing. Only the occasional industrial pendant light turned on overhead, and the emergency light was flashing right above my head. No other light source is strong enough to cast such a clear shadow at the end of the hallway. With an effort of will, I returned to the task of removing the old light bulb. My hands are shaking a bit. As I was fiddling with the lamp holder, I glanced quickly toward the end of the hallway, and this time, my heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. The shadow has moved. It no longer stands still in its original position, some distance away. It has moved, if only a little, but it's not a graceful, natural movement. It feels like a short, sudden jerk, almost convulsive. It was as if it had stepped through part of the wall and was now floating, half in and half out of physical space. An absurd and terrifying image to the extreme. I almost dropped both the new light bulb and the old light bulb. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel the painful thud in my ears. I had to clench my teeth, breathe through my nose, trying desperately to stay calm. The light bulb needs to be replaced. That is my duty. I told myself to focus on that. With steady light, I could see more clearly, able to confirm whether it was just an illusion or not. As soon as I finished inserting the new bulb into the socket and tightening it, there was a slight click sound. The entire hallway suddenly lit up in a blue-white fluorescent light, harsh and somewhat cold. It erased all the darkness that flickered before. Taking a deep breath, I slowly turned back to look at the wall where the shadow had once stood. It's gone. Completely disappeared. There are no traces left. But instead of feeling relieved, every hair on my body stood up. Even though the shape was gone, I felt more certain than ever that I was not alone. The hallway seemed to breathe in sync with me, a heavy, suffocating silence, as if the space itself was alive, aware of my presence, and of that other thing. My palms were drenched in cold sweat. My heart was still pounding in my throat, as if choking me. I told myself that the exhaustion and loneliness of the night shift were playing tricks on me. Maybe I just need to rest for a while, have a cup of coffee. But that nagging fear refused to let go. It clung to me like a second skin, cold and uncomfortable. I quickly climbed down the ladder and put it back in the nearby maintenance cabinet. On my way back to the main production area, I passed by one of the small employee break rooms. Warm yellow light shines from the slightly open door. Inside, a colleague, one of the few who also works at this hour in another area, is finishing his cup of coffee. He glanced quickly at me, then paused, his eyes somewhat questioning. "You look so pale," he said, his voice a little sleepy. "Are you okay?" I just nodded lightly, trying to give a forced smile. I mumbled something about being startled by a strange flashing light in the old hallway. I don't dare tell the details about the shadow. Sounds so crazy. He shrugged, looking sympathetic but not very concerned. "Yeah, those old hallways," he said. "It looks really scary at night. Don't pay too much attention." He seemed completely calm, not panicked at all. That somehow calmed me down a bit. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe it's just my imagination. But that feeling of being watched, that feeling of not being alone, still refused to go away. It was like an invisible thorn deeply embedded in my mind. Determined to maintain my work routine, as a way to cling to reality, I continued to make rounds through the production areas. The sound of conveyor belts rattling rhythmically, the sound of machinery clanging somewhere in the distance, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing like giant insects. I checked the gauges at each station, recording the data in my work diary. The familiar noise of the factory was almost comforting now, a sharp contrast to the oppressive, unnatural silence of that distant hallway. But that temporary peace did not last. Occasionally, when passing through hidden corners and empty paths, I swear I saw something, or someone, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. It was always a fleeting shadow, gliding quickly into a dark corner, a shadowy shape hidden behind a pile of abandoned crates. Every time that happens, my heart skips a beat. I turn my head immediately, my eyes scanning the space quickly. But every time I couldn't find anything. There were only empty aisles, silent machines, and yellow lights shining on the cold concrete floor. Paranoia began to gnaw at me. My breathing became shallower and faster every time I entered a dimly lit area. My hands began to tremble slightly, and cold sweat soaked the back of my shirt. The entire factory now no longer feels safe. It was like beating to some hidden heartbeat, a ghostly beat in sync with my own rising panic. Several times, I stopped suddenly, held my breath, and strained my ears to listen. I was almost certain that I would hear soft footsteps behind me. But each time, all that reached my ears was the steady, distant hum of the machines. Around 2 a.m., when my work schedule forced me to return to the area where that scary hallway was located, a strange urge overcame me. I felt like I had to go back there and check again. I needed to prove to myself that there was a completely reasonable explanation for the shadow I had seen. That it was just the light, the fatigue, the imagination. I need to face my fears. When I reached the beginning of the hallway, the newly replaced emergency light was still shining brightly and steadily. Its harsh white light made this passage almost too bright, contrasting with the dense darkness of the surrounding areas. I stood there for a moment, my eyes scanning along the cold concrete wall. I noticed chipped bricks near the base of the wall, streaks of rust like dried blood. A strange stench, faint but distinct, lingered in the air, the smell of old oxidized metal and the smell of moldy, rotting fabric. My stomach tightened again. I walked slowly into the hallway, my own footsteps echoing ominously in the quiet space. As I stood near the exact spot where the old light had flickered, where I had first seen the shadow, something unexpected happened. The new emergency light, which had been shining steadily, suddenly flickered. Only once. A weak blink, like the fragile beat of a heart about to stop. And in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it again. The shadow. This time, it was no longer on the wall. It seemed to be standing just a few meters away from me, right in the middle of the hallway. It floated there, not attached to any physical form that I could discern. A mass of solid darkness, with hazy, indistinct edges, but darker than the darkness around it when the lights went out. And even though it had no discernible facial features, I could have sworn it was facing me. A feeling of being seen through, being scrutinized to the core. A cold, paralyzing wave of fear spread through my body. My muscles were so tight that I could barely move. My heart was pounding, frantically in my chest, each beat louder and more intense than the last. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and cold sweat broke out on my forehead, running down my temples. In a crazy moment, my instincts screamed at me to run away from that thing immediately. But a strange fascination, a morbid curiosity held me back. I want to understand what it is. Or at least, I want confirmation that it's really there, not an illusion. My mind frantically tried to find reasonable explanations. Could it be a trick of the residual light? Or a temporary burn on the retina after looking at bright lights? But no, I still see it. Stand there, motionless, but undeniably present. The overhead light flickered again, coming back on. and in the steady white light that followed, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared again. I forced myself to move. Every step is a fight against the adrenaline flowing through my veins. My breathing was panting and rapid, as if I had just run a marathon. My mouth was dry, my tongue felt stuck to my palate. In my head, the image of that floating shadow kept replaying over and over, haunting. What did I see? Is it a person? So where did they go? And if it's not, then what am I facing? I almost ran out of the hallway, but turned into a small maintenance bay right next to it. The walls here were lined with boards filled with tools, and there were several partially repaired machine parts lying on the workbenches. My plan was to quickly check to see if everything was okay, and hope that the familiarity of the tools and routine would calm me down and bring me back to reality. The overhead light in the maintenance bay emitted a faint, steady hum, but I heard another sound creeping underneath it. It's that dripping sound again. Regularly, rhythmically, it was as if someone was tapping on some metal pipe, perhaps above the ceiling. My fingertips tingled with a strong desire to turn on all the light switches in the room, dispelling the shadows that were creeping into the hidden corners, places where the only light could not reach. I started to feel a slight pressure in my head, as if the air was thinning, making it harder to breathe. My vision blurred for a moment, and I had to shake my head vigorously to try to regain focus. That's when I caught a glimpse of movement. Near the tool rack in the corner of the room, a dark shape lingered behind a row of tall metal shelves. It seemed to be looking at me through the gaps between the shelves. I couldn't see any eyes, but the feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost tangible, making my throat tighten. I felt like a cornered animal, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run. I took a step back, then another, my chest so tight that it was hard to breathe. The shape slowly slid out from behind the shelves. It was closer now, but still vague, impossible to clearly define. It didn't look like a solid object, but like the very air there had darkened, solidified into a warped, deformed void that seemed to vibrate slightly, its pulse beating in a terrifying rhythm. My heart beat so violently that I felt nauseous. I tried to speak up, perhaps to call someone, or to shout, but my voice couldn't escape my throat. The silence in the small room became heavy and oppressive. Finally, my mind screamed at my legs to move, and they obeyed mechanically. I turned around unsteadily and rushed back into the main hallway, half running and half tripping. My footsteps echoed frantically on the concrete floor, pounding desperately. At every turn, I still felt that presence right behind me, as if it were following closely on my heels, just outside the edge of my vision. Occasionally, my eyes would catch a fleeting sign, a flickering shadow, a glimmer of darkness, but it was always gone as soon as I turned around to check. Finally, I reached the main production area. The familiar noise of machines now feels like a blessing, a salvation. That wall of sound seemed to drown out the screaming fear inside me, even if just for a moment. There were several other workers at work, stationed at intervals, each busy with his own work. They paid little attention to me as I rushed into their area, although a few glanced, perhaps noticing my pale, panicked expression. One of them, an older man with a stern face, asked me if I needed to sit down and rest for a while. I nodded vigorously, deciding that was the best thing to do right now. I found a hidden, secluded corner behind towering stacks of pallets, and sat down on the cold floor. I tried to stabilize my panting and rapid breathing. My clothes stuck to my skin, damp from cold sweat. My hands were still shaking uncontrollably. But even here, amidst the noise and light of the production area, that feeling of being watched still does not let go. It was still like a pair of invisible eyes glued to the back of my neck, at the base of my skull. Every minute passed heavily. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was just the flickering lights, the fatigue, the maze of dark hallways that made my imagination run wild. But every time I closed my eyes, even for just a moment, I saw that figure floating, dark, indistinct but menacing. My body kept trembling slightly. The hum of the surrounding factories became distant and hollow, as if I were hearing it through a thick layer of water. Finally, I decided I couldn't spend the rest of my shift cowering in fear like this. I needed some closure, an answer, no matter how scary it was. I need to know. Forcing my still shaking legs to move, I stood up. I'm back, towards that last hallway. Third time. This time, I was determined to confront whatever was there, even if it only existed in my mind. The urge to find answers, whatever they were, temporarily overpowered the fear screaming inside. At least at that time. When I arrived, the hallway was eerily silent. The new emergency light still shines steadily, its white light revealing every dirty detail, every crack in the old concrete wall. The shadows stretched long and thin, blending together at the far end of the hallway. My heart was pounding in my chest again, but I forced myself to step forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if I were wading through invisible mud. When I was about halfway there, I heard it. A whisper. Weak, gentle, like a gentle breeze passing through the cracks in the wall. I couldn't hear the words clearly. It was like a series of meaningless sounds, but it was enough to make every hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped suddenly, straining my ears to listen, my eyes scanning the empty hallway. Wait, and then the light flashed again. A brief, sudden blink, plunging the hallway into almost complete darkness in a heartbeat. In that dark moment, I saw that figure again. This time, it was right in front of me, just a few steps away, silent, towering, and it was incredibly black, blacker than the surrounding night. A jolt of pure, primal terror ran down my spine. I staggered back, almost falling backwards. My blood vessels felt like they were about to burst, pounding like thunder in my ears. A wave of primal fight or flight instincts raged through me. Adrenaline screamed at me to defend myself. But defend yourself against what? How can you fight a shadow? My mouth is dry and bitter. My hand tingled like thousands of needles. My breathing was rapid, hissing in my ears. The light stabilized again, and just like before, that shape disappeared. There was only me left, standing there, panting frantically, and cold white light illuminated an empty hallway. But even though I couldn't see anything anymore, the feeling of another presence became stronger than ever. It's here. Just recently, my instincts screamed that something was just outside my vision, lurking in hidden corners, waiting for my next move. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my last bit of courage. I tried to speak, though my voice came out only as a weak, hoarse hiss. I asked, almost begged, that if there was something there, please show yourself. The hallway remained silent, except for the steady, distant sound of dripping metal echoing from somewhere. A new wave of fear rolled over me, this time colder. It felt as if the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Finally, I realized that I couldn't endure this confrontation any longer. This is no longer a matter of courage. It was like the very air in the hallway had become thick, filled with hostility, weighing heavily on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. My mind, no matter how hard I tried to rationalize, was now completely convinced that this place held a presence that I couldn't explain, something that was not of this world. I turned around and walked away, almost running. I forced my shaking legs to carry me out of that place as quickly as possible. Every few steps, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting and half afraid to see that dark shadow quietly chasing me. But all I saw was the bright, steady glow of the emergency light, illuminating a hauntingly empty space. I ended my shift in a state of physical and mental exhaustion. The shift supervisor, when I handed over the work, indirectly asked about my condition. His eyes showed concern when he saw the sweat still beaded on my forehead and my hands were still shaking slightly. I only gave a vague explanation about a near accident with a certain piece of machinery. I don't dare tell the truth. How can I tell? Sounds so wild, so crazy. That truth is now buried somewhere deep in the back of my mind. And honestly, sometimes I'm not even sure if I really believe it. But I know, in my heart, I know. Whatever I saw that night, it was real enough to haunt me. Since that terrible night, my life in the factory has changed. I still continue to work, still patrolling, still recording data. But I meticulously avoided that hallway at all costs. Whenever possible, I will take a detour, even if it is further. When avoidance is impossible, when work forces me to pass through it, I move as fast as I can, keeping my eyes straight ahead, trying my best not to glance at the old walls, into the dark corners. But even when my gaze was forward, I still felt it. Always feel it there. A silent figure, waiting at the edge of my vision, challenged my sanity. It never physically attacked me, never touched me. But the oppressive aura it radiated was enough to make my heart clench, making my skin cold every time I was near that place. It has become an ever-present threat in my mind, an unanswered question that keeps me awake at night. Did I really see something supernatural? Or was it just the long work hours and extreme loneliness that had chipped away at my perception of reality? To this day, I still can't completely shake the feeling that it's still watching me. Sometimes, I catch a strange shadow in the corner of my eye, right in my own house, or on an empty, unlit street at night. A fleeting shape, a flickering movement, a sudden chill in the air when there shouldn't have been. Each time, my heart contracted, and my breath caught in my throat. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, a product of lingering trauma from that night. But deep inside, I always wondered, can I really get away with it? And perhaps that nagging doubt is the real horror. The knowledge that fear does not have to be physically manifest to be real. Maybe it just exists inside you forever, like a cold ink stain spread across your soul, always reminding you of that shadow in the quiet hallway, aware of your presence, and maybe, just maybe, it's still waiting, hidden among the flashing lights and humming machines in that old factory, ready to appear again when someone feels a little too isolated, a little too scared, a little too alone in the cruel night. My name is Victor. I'm not one to seek adventure or mystery. I'm just an ordinary man who moved to this apartment complex a few years ago, hoping to find some peace and quiet after stressful working hours. Initially, I was really happy to know that my building was located right next to a preserved forest, a pristine green patch in the middle of a noisy city. There is something romantic, almost comforting, about thinking that nature is just a few steps away. A place to breathe fresh air, to temporarily forget daily worries. But recently, that comfort has gradually turned into a persistent source of insecurity, a dull fear that grows with each passing night. It all started off so innocently enough that I almost didn't pay attention at first. Due to the nature of my work, I often have to come home very late, when the apartment parking lot is deserted and night has fallen. The night air often feels unusually thick here, as if the atmosphere itself is conspiring to suffocate me with fear. Even the faint light of the moon, when it penetrated the clouds, illuminating the treetops in the forest, seemed only a flickering, sickly light, not bringing any comfort. There's something about that strip of trees, that dark edge separating the civilized world from the wild, that always makes me pause for a moment before entering the house. And in those moments of pause, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. When I step out of the car and breathe in the fresh but heavy evening air, I often feel like I catch a glimpse of movement among the trees. Just something very fast, at the edge of my vision, like a shadow rushing out of sight as soon as I turned my head. At first, I told myself it was just a trick of my eyes in the low light, or maybe it was the wind moving the bushes or some small animal passing by. Completely normal. But it doesn't stop there. The glimpses became more frequent, and sometimes they seemed more clear. Some nights, I swear I catch a glimpse of a figure, a tall, thin figure, leaning against a large oak tree near the edge of the forest. It was almost like someone was peeking out to observe the parking lot, then quickly ducked down and hid themselves as soon as I turned my head to look straight in that direction. I started to wonder, perhaps it was another night watchman of the neighborhood, or a late stroller, or perhaps an intruder of some kind, a homeless person seeking temporary shelter in the darkness. Reasonable explanations still exist, but my skin still prickled every time, and a chill ran down my spine, lasting long after I was safely inside my apartment. On one particular evening a few weeks ago, after catching a glimpse of that figure again, I decided I had had enough of this ambiguity. An irresistible curiosity, combined with a somewhat stubborn pride, forced me to investigate. I cannot live forever in this feeling of insecurity. I need to know the truth. I went back to the car and took a fairly powerful flashlight from the trunk. Taking a deep breath to gain courage, I strode toward the tree line, straight into the darkness. I was determined to prove to myself that there was nothing scary there, that it was all just my imagination. The powerful beam of the flashlight penetrated the darkness, illuminating every gnarled tree stump and every tangled fern bush under the wet ground. The light swept through each trunk of oak and pine trees, highlighting the rough bark and dry leaves rustling under my feet. But there wasn't any sign of a human being. There were no obvious footprints on the soft ground. No tree branches were broken abnormally. There was no sign of a passageway or a makeshift shelter. There is only silence and darkness of the old forest. I stood there for a while, between the silent trees, the flashlight scanning back and forth into the unknown space ahead. And then I heard it, a sigh, very weak, gentle, almost imperceptible amid the gentle sound of the wind rustling in the treetops. But there can be no mistake. It was a human sigh. My heart felt like it was wobbling in my chest. The hair on my arms stood up. Startled, I whipped the flashlight around in a crazy arc, shining the light into every tree and bush in sight. But all I saw were ancient tree trunks standing tall like ghosts and dense clusters of leaves, motionless in the night. After a minute of breathlessly tense silence, without hearing any more sounds, I had to retreat. I walked back to the parking lot, feeling both stupid for scaring myself and strangely shaken. That sigh, although very soft, still echoes in my mind. Over the next week, my routine remained unchanged. I still came home late, still parked in the same place. And every night, before entering the house, I can't help but look towards the forest, my eyes scanning every shadow of the trees, my ears listening to every smallest noise. Sometimes nothing unusual happens, just the familiar rustling of leaves in the night wind, the quiet hum of vehicles echoing in the distance. At those times, I almost convinced myself that everything was just because I was too stressed. But on other nights, I swear I've seen that same shape, lurking somewhere in the deep darkness of the forest. One time, when my car's headlights accidentally scanned the edge of the forest while turning a corner, I discovered something that looked exactly like an arm. A long, thin, and strangely pale arm, sliding out from behind a large tree. It only appeared for an extremely short moment, then disappeared immediately when I tried to focus my eyes on it. My heart was pounding in my chest again. My throat is dry. I couldn't explain why I was so restless over the slightest movement. But there's something inherently wrong about it. The way it moved, its pale color under the car lights. It was more like I had seen part of a ghost's body than a branch or an illusion of light. The rational part of my brain still tried to calm me down. Maybe it was just a patch of peeling bark? Or does the moonlight shining through the leaves create strange shapes? But the image of that unrealistically pale, skinny arm refused to leave my mind. Keeps haunting me, creeping into my dreams. As the days passed, my nerves began to stretch like strings. Insecurity is no longer limited to coming home late. Sometimes, even during the day, I feel watched. I stood in the kitchen, looking out the window toward the forest, and it felt like invisible eyes were responding to my gaze from among the thick bushes. One time, a neighbor happened to meet me in the hallway and asked if I was okay. He commented that I looked pale and tired. I just brushed it off, saying that I've had a lot of work these days and I'm just a little sleep deprived. But I know the truth is not just that. The lingering, nagging feeling that I was being watched from that forest was weighing heavily on my mind, eroding my calm little by little. My sleep became restless and interrupted. I often wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding for no apparent reason, with a strong belief that something is standing right outside my bedroom door or lurking right behind the thin window curtain. Of course, every time I worked up the courage to check, there was no one there. Just an empty hallway, a quiet balcony under the yellow streetlight. But in the distant background of endless thoughts before falling back to sleep, the image of the forest appeared again, looming like a dark promise, reminding me of that weak sigh and of the fleeting light of a pale arm in the middle of the night. Then came a particularly cold night not long ago. I arrived home with a tension headache throbbing behind my temples. The apartment parking lot was deserted as usual. The overhead street lights occasionally flickered in the flickering, sinister way of old fluorescent bulbs about to fail. I still remember the feeling when I got out of the car. The atmosphere that night seemed to change instantly, becoming unusually heavy and still. Even the gentle, familiar hum of night insects seemed to fall silent, as if they too were holding their breath waiting for something. Out of habit, I looked towards the forest. My heart felt like it stopped beating for a beat, then started pounding again like it was about to burst. There was a shape standing there, just beyond the first line of trees, closer than ever before. It was almost as tall as I was, and had the vague but distinct shape of a person. It stood motionless in the darkness, a dark silhouette among the even blacker trees. My chest felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. My hands trembled as I searched for the phone in my pocket. I turned on the flashlight function, trying to illuminate it so I could see better. But the weak light from the phone was not strong enough and could not reach far enough to penetrate that thick layer of darkness. All I saw was still an indecipherable black mass, standing still and menacing. With my heart pounding against my chest, I slowly moved a few steps closer, as if hypnotized. I could hear my own rapid, shallow breathing echoing in my ears in the dead silence. Suddenly, a very soft, but clear, rustling sound of leaves came from that direction. It was as if it had just shifted its body weight, or lightly stepped on a dry leaf floor. Adrenaline surged through my veins. A wave of hot heat shot through his limbs. I want to scream, want to call it, want to ask who it is, what it wants to do. Part of me believes that if I face this presence head-on, I can understand my fear, can break this terrifying silence. But my vocal cords felt completely paralyzed. No sound could escape. After a moment of silence that felt like an eternity, the shape slowly faded into the deeper darkness of the forest. It doesn't run. There was no sound of branches breaking, just a quiet, terrifyingly slow retreat. It was more like a ghost fading away than a person running away. When I regained my composure and ran to the exact spot where I had seen it standing, I found nothing. There were only dead leaves scattered on the ground and the strong smell of damp soil and rotting leaves. I used my phone's flashlight to scan the surroundings again and again, but only saw empty tree trunks and dense darkness. That's when I realized I was sweating profusely, despite the cold evening. T-shirt sticks tightly to the back. My hands were shaking so much that the light from the phone kept flickering, dancing wildly on the ground in chaotic streaks of light. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, even though each inhale felt razor-sharp in my lungs. I told myself I would go into the house immediately, lock the door, and forget everything that had just happened. But as I turned my back to walk towards the building, another sigh rang out. This time it was lower and much closer than last time. It rang out right behind me, in the silence of the deserted parking lot. I just shivered once, then turned around mechanically, facing the darkness. Primal, uncontrollable fear filled his veins. I can't think anymore. I run. I ran as fast as I could towards the main door of my apartment building, not daring to look back even once. That night, I hardly slept at all. Every time I close my eyes, my mind goes back to that forest. I heard that ghostly sigh again. I again pictured the black shadow quietly retreating into the darkness. I felt the coldness of that presence right behind me again. The next day, in a desperate attempt to find reassurance or at least a reasonable explanation, I tried to confide in an acquaintance who lived a few apartments away. He's a pretty friendly guy, even though we don't talk often. He listened politely as I tried to explain the strange sights I had seen, the claustrophobic, watched feeling coming from the woods next to my house. He pondered for a moment, then suggested that perhaps it was just the local wildlife. He says that animals like deer or even large raccoons can sometimes look human in the dark, especially when light hits them in strange ways. Perhaps it was just a stray deer, or a pet that had escaped its cage and was wandering in the woods. He tried to reassure me, but I noticed the way he discreetly avoided eye contact with me as he said those words, as if my story actually worried him more than he wanted to admit. After that conversation, I didn't feel any better. If anything had changed, my discomfort and insecurity would have skyrocketed. I don't believe I simply confused animals with human forms. Every fiber, every nerve cell in my body confirmed that this was something different, something unusual. A few evenings later, I decided to try checking out the forest again, but this time at dusk, just before it got dark. I reasoned that the fading daylight might provide enough visibility to dispel my fears, or at least let me see more clearly what was really going on out there. The forest looked less threatening in the weak light of late afternoon. The last rays of sunlight penetrated through the leaves, creating golden streaks of light on the moist ground. I ventured in the same direction I had gone the first time with the flashlight, heading a little deeper. The ground was soft and spongy under the soles of my sneakers. The air was damp and cool, carrying the smell of leaves and damp earth. Tall bushes and vast tree trunks obscured my view in many parts. And as I was moving around an ancient oak tree, a cold, thorny feeling spread across the back of my neck. It was that primal instinct again. It spoke up again, telling me that I was not alone. My chest tightened. My eyes opened wide. Right in front of me, leaning against another huge pine tree, was a crude, makeshift arrangement of dry branches. They are stacked on top of each other, leaning against the tree trunks, almost forming a kind of half-roof tent or shelter, tilted to one side. It doesn't look like it was created by nature. I swallowed hard, trying to push the lump in my throat down, then cautiously stepped closer. Inside that makeshift structure, an unpleasant odor arose, the smell of rotting leaves mixed with something else, a musty, fishy smell that made my stomach churn. I used my hand to gently push a half-broken branch aside to look inside. On the ground covered with dry leaves, there were a few old, damp pieces of cloth, looking like tattered clothes. And there was also something that looked like a chipped ceramic cup, lying around in a corner. My pulse beats faster. Clearly someone was spending time here. But who? And why in such a remote, dark place like this? The thought of some stranger secluded in the woods near my house, or even just passing by and setting up a makeshift camp, was unpleasant enough. But it's not impossible. However, there's something very wrong about this shelter. The way the branches are arranged, they are not simply piled on top of each other. They evoke a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. It's as if they were placed there intentionally, with a purpose, not just to cover the rain or sun in a hurry. That realization sent a cold bolt of fear through me. I quickly backed away, almost tripping over a rotten tree stump in my haste. My breathing became rapid. Cold sweat began to break out on his forehead. I don't want to stay here another second. I forced myself to go back to the apartment, my nerves as tight as strings. On the way home, I tried to calm myself again. Maybe it's just a long-abandoned campsite, or a local who likes to observe wildlife and set up a makeshift tent incognito. But the feeling of fear, the feeling that something dark and unusual was going on in that forest, still refused to let go. That night, my paranoia reached its peak. I felt as if I was standing on the edge of an abyss, my mind reeling with half-asked questions, half-remembered, half-forgotten details. I started to doubt everything. Am I really seeing a pale arm, or is it just a trick of the light? Could that sigh be just the sound of the wind blowing through the dense branches? But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more my thoughts returned to the image of that strangely arranged makeshift tent of tree branches, and the pungent, unpleasant smell within it. The forest outside seemed to pulse to some dark rhythm of life, even when I was in my apartment. I couldn't shake the impression that someone or something was out there, observing, waiting. A few days of uncomfortably quiet followed. I tried to distract myself with work, with chores around the house, with watching useless TV shows. But I am always acutely aware of the presence of the forest, especially after dark. I found myself looking out the window more often, my eyes automatically scanning the trees to check for any unusual movement. My heart often pounds for no reason. My palms were always cold and sweaty, as if I was always mentally preparing for something terrible to happen. Sleep remains an elusive luxury. I often wake up in the middle of the night, wide awake, and believe I hear leaves rustling right outside my bedroom window. My skin would be cold and tingly, a wave of fear running from my scalp to my heels. It was in this state of extreme anxiety, on the brink of mental breakdown, that a final incident occurred, shattering any remaining sense of normalcy within me. It was another late night coming home. The sky was pitch black, no moon or stars. The familiar anxiety rose again as I pulled into the parking lot, turning my gaze toward the dark row of trees. The flickering streetlights seemed weaker than ever, barely able to illuminate the road in front of me. As I stopped the car and was about to get out, that familiar rustling sound attracted my attention again. This time it was bigger, clearer. My muscles stiffened immediately. I hurriedly shined the flashlight from my phone towards the bushes where the sound came from. And then I saw it. Or perhaps this time it allowed itself to be seen. A tall figure was standing just behind one of the short bushes closest to the edge of the forest. Stood there, silent. But this time I can see more details. I saw its arms, thicker arms, stronger than I expected, were clutching the bark of a nearby tree. It gripped so tightly it was almost painful, as if its fingers were digging deep into the wood. I still couldn't recognize its face. Its head was hidden in the shadow of the branches above. But I got enough of a glimpse to realize that it was a human shape, or at least something very close to human. My heart was beating so violently that I thought I might faint on the spot. My vision began to narrow at the edges. Every breath feels like being sucked into sharp pieces of ice. For a long moment, the figure did not move. It just stood there, watching me, as if pleased to see my scared reaction. Then, in a graceful, almost eerily fluid motion, it slid gently around the trunk, disappearing into the darkness and reappearing in another gap between the branches. It moved without making any significant noise, like a ghost gliding. I don't remember when I dropped my phone, but I heard it hit the asphalt. My mind screamed at me to run immediately, but my legs felt frozen in place, bound by a primal fear. A numb feeling began to spread from my ankle, as if some invisible force wanted to hold me, frozen there, as its prey. Finally, with a superhuman effort of will, I managed to jerk my body forward. I bent down to quickly pick up the phone, then, not daring to look back, ran like crazy towards the front door of the building. My entire body was drenched in cold sweat as I slammed the heavy door behind me. But the horror is not over yet. That night, as I sat huddled on the sofa in the living room, trying to calm myself, I believed someone was right in the hallway outside my apartment. I heard the floorboards creaking right behind the main door. It creaked in a slow, steady, deliberate rhythm. It was as if someone's footsteps were walking back and forth, right in front of my door. I stood close to the wall next to the door, my ear pressed tightly against the cold wooden surface, holding my breath and listening. Hot tears of fear began to sting my eyes. After a long struggle, I mustered up the courage to dare look through the tiny peephole on the door. The hallway is deserted. Not a single person in sight. The yellow light illuminated a silent space. But the sound continued. The sound of the floor creaking. Steady. Slow. It lasted for hours, torturing my nerves. Trapped adrenaline rushed through me as I alternately pressed my ear against the door and paced frantically around the living room, feeling like I was going crazy. It was not until the weak dawn light began to creep through the window that the noises stopped completely. I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion for a while on the couch, because I woke up with a start to see daylight flooding the living room through the curtains. A wave of relief and extreme fatigue washed over me. I spent that morning fighting with myself. Part of me wanted to run away immediately, get as far away from this place as possible. But another part, a stubborn and perhaps stupid part, urged me to face this presence, whatever it was. I needed to regain peace of mind, or at least find answers. With a newfound determination, albeit filled with fear, I ventured out at noon. I walked straight to the edge of the forest, to the exact place where I had seen that figure last night. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but the bright, clear daylight gave me a semblance of bravery, even as I was trembling inside. I looked around carefully. There were no new footprints. There were no suspicious debris. There was no sign that anyone had been standing there last night. Instead, a deep, almost unnatural stillness enveloped everything. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stayed there for nearly an hour, wandering from tree to tree, my eyes constantly searching. I even called out, with a shaky but determined voice, that if anyone was there, please appear. But in the end, no one came. Nothing happened. Feeling depressed, tired, and somewhat stupid, I returned home. Then, just before it started to get completely dark, as I was standing in front of my apartment door, about to put the key in the lock, I noticed something that made the blood in my veins freeze. Leaning against my front door is a tree branch, a dry, broken branch. It looked exactly like the branches I had seen used to build that ominous shelter in the woods. Couldn't have just fallen here. It looked like it had been placed there intentionally. The end of the branch is also sharpened slightly. My stomach turned when I realized that. It must have been left here while I was at home, or while I was wandering in the woods. This is a message, a word of warning, or a threat. Fear flared up fiercely in my chest again. I felt my face heat up, then my limbs became cold, as if there were pins and needles. At that moment, I decided, I have to leave, at least for a while. I can't stay here another night. I rushed into the house and quickly grabbed a small travel bag. My hands shook as I threw clothes and essentials into my bag haphazardly. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me, as if I was being constantly monitored through windows or walls. I wonder if that figure is right outside? Maybe it was standing in the parking lot, silently observing my every move. My chest tightened, and my mouth was so dry that it was difficult to swallow. I packed my bags in record time, my heart beating stronger with every second. When I opened the door to step out into the hallway, I stopped for a second, half expecting and half afraid to see that figure standing waiting. But the hallway was empty. There was only yellow light and silence. My footsteps echoed loudly on the floor as I hurried towards the elevator. The trip down seemed to last forever, each floor passing with agonizing slowness. I couldn't stop picturing the figure from the night before, the way it stood there, the way it moved, the way it seemed to be hungry for my fear. My skin tingled as I remembered that feeling. Finally, I exited the building and headed toward the parking lot. The sun had begun to set, and long shadows were stretching across the asphalt. For a moment, I stood there, my eyes quickly glancing toward the tree line one last time. And in that look, I felt it again. The feeling of being suffocated, of being watched. The shadows in the forest seemed to be swirling together, forming an impenetrable black wall. My lungs burned as if I couldn't get enough air. I forced my legs to move. Halfway to the car, I still half expected to see a pale arm or a tall figure emerge from between the trees. But nothing appeared. I climbed into the car and started the engine. I refused to look over my shoulder as I backed out of the parking space. As I pulled the car out of the parking lot, headlights grazed the first few trees of the forest. Just before I turned the corner completely onto the main road, I caught a glimpse of movement in that shifting darkness. Maybe it was a person, or maybe it's just my imagination playing tricks on me again. My heartbeat was pounding madly in my ears. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Without thinking for another second, I pressed hard on the accelerator and drove away from that scary place, leaving the forest and its dark secrets behind. To this day, I still don't know exactly what I encountered in that forest, or why it seems to stick with me, haunting me like that. Maybe it was all in my head, a product of exhaustion, stress, and an overactive imagination. Or perhaps it was something stranger, more ancient, an entity tied to that land in ways I couldn't understand. Whenever I closed my eyes, I could still see it, its motionless silhouette among the trees, and feel its invisible gaze following me as I retreated. It haunts me in quiet moments, from sleeping to waking, whispering that it is still out there, waiting for me to return. Even though I was hundreds of miles away from that apartment, I still couldn't escape the looming, nagging feeling of fear. The image of the broken tree branch leaning against my door is still burned into my memory, an unmistakable sign that something wanted me to go, or wanted me to know that it could reach me wherever I was. Sometimes, on quiet late nights, when I'm alone, I hear that faint sigh echoing in my mind. It lingers like a cold breath in the ear, A reminder that some horrors, real or not, never truly go away. And even though I escaped that place, I was always aware of something disturbing. That perhaps I was just delaying something inevitable. A deep part of me believes that, some night in the future, no matter how far away I am, I will again feel movement in the darkness, shapes snaking between the silent trees. And when that day comes, I will be forced to face that horror again. My heart is pounding again, my mouth is dry, my skin is tingling with cold sweat even thinking about it. Even now, when I look into the darkness outside the window, I wonder, is that figure still there? An eternal watchman, silently measuring every terrifying beat of my heart. Every night, in this old building where I am temporarily staying, the air seems to become thick and stuffy at the exact moment the darkness completely subsides. It was as if it was electrified, charged by some malignant presence I couldn't name. This place is always buzzing with a quiet tension, something that seeps into my bones, tightening my chest and making each breath labored. Even when I was standing on the street, before deciding to move here, I remember staring at its old, weathered facade and wondering, why do the lights in the windows on the top floor keep flashing erratically and irregularly? It was as if someone or something was pacing endlessly behind those opaque glass panels. At the time, I told myself that maybe it was just the age of the building. The electrical wiring system is too old and of poor quality. Or maybe it's just the sound of the night wind rattling the rickety windows. But then, after I moved in and accidentally discovered the disturbing truth, that there was nothing on that top floor except a vast, desolate, long-abandoned rooftop terrace, a nagging, vague fear began to coil in my chest. A voice whispered from somewhere in my subconscious that maybe what I saw wasn't simply a broken light. Maybe there was something really up there in the darkness,